Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Mitra Goa and I'm going over the game between Gukesh versus Magnus. So Gukesh got another chance to play against Magnus and this time he got the white pieces and it was a perfect game for the revenge. Gukesh started with e4, Magnus played e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, the very theoretical Ruy Lopez, knight f6, Magnus goes for the Berlin, d3, bishop c5, bishop c3. So this is called the anti-Berlin. The Berlin would have been if white had gone here, knight c4, d4, knight d6, takes, ef, d into e5, knight f5, queen d8, king d8. This is called the Berlin endgame, which is notorious for being too drawish. So white generally avoids this. White goes d3, bishop c5, c3, castle, d6, h3. This is a pretty normal move, and it's also kind of a waiting move, trying to see what black does. It also stops sometimes knight g4 if white had gone rook e1. Black can go knight g4 and like this black can annoy white. So h3, a6, bishop comes back a4, h6. So black also says that I'll also wait, I'll see what you do. So white plays rook e1. Now that there's no knight g4, b5, bishop c2, bishop b6. And I think this is the moment when Gukesh went out of book and he had a long 13 minutes think here. He played knight bd2. So knight bd2 is very common here. The knight generally goes to f1 to g3 and like for in the future like trying to go to f5. Magnus played knight e7. He also wants the knight to go to g6 and f4 in the future. Gukesh played a4, rook b8, d4. It's a very typical break in the Ruy Lopez and threatening to take on e5 and win a pawn, but of course Magnus saves the pawn, knight g6. White goes knight f1, c5. Magnus breaks open the center. If white had gone d5, black can play c5 and this bishop becomes a monster. So Gukesh goes knight g3. Magnus takes with the c pawn. Gukesh takes back. B into f4, bishop into f4. So now you can see that the opening has gone pretty well for Magnus. He has all his pieces developed. He has a rook on the open file. The b6 bishop is very strong. And the c2 bishop, which is supposed to be on this diagonal, is actually unable to go there because it doesn't have a strong hold on the b3 square. Magnus went bishop b7. Gukesh went d5, just closing off this diagonal. a5, a very nice move, creating another open diagonal for this bishop. Here Gukesh played a very interesting move, but which is not actually the best move, but because he should have gone b3 here, cementing this bishop, and if Magnus went bishop a6, he can go bishop c6, bishop c5, queen c2, bishop b4, and something like rook d1, and he should be fine because of this strong c6 bishop. But he went bishop e3. Magnus played this nice move, bishop c8, controlling this f5 square so that there's no knight f5 in the future. Gukesh now went b3, bishop into e3, rook into e3, knight f4. So exchanges, this bishop has got rid of this very strong b6 bishop, but has allowed the g6 knight to jump to f4, which is also very annoying. Gukesh plants the bishop on c6 with b4. So now Magnus starts his true positional grind, attacking the e4 pawn, creating some kinds of threat like this, getting the queen to b6. Gukesh went queen c2. He plays g6. It's also another very nice move. It covers the f5 square, and now this bishop is free to move from c8. King h1. Actually, Gukesh is kind of out of plans. If we move this knight, there might be h5, h4, hitting this knight and e4 pawn. If we can't really move this knight from here. For example, if you go here, we can just come bishop a6 and just take this knight. So I think this is kind of a waiting move. Black goes bishop a6. Here Gukesh blunders and plays queen a2. He actually missed the point of this move. He should have gone as rook c3. h5 and maybe rook e1, king g7, and wait for another move like king g1, because h4 is kind of guarded by this knight. The problem with queen a2 is he can come bishop d3, and that's a very important square for the bishop, because from here it just threatens to capture the e4 pawn. Gukesh went knight d2, supporting this pawn, and now the problem is clear. The knight moves from here, the h4 square is unprotected, black goes h5, threatening h4 and take on e4. Gukesh took the a5 pawn, queen a5, rook a5, and Magnus goes h4. Even though Magnus is a pawn down here, but he's just going to get back the e4 pawn. Gukesh went rook a4, rook b8. The point is, if he had taken here and, for example, take here and takes the knight, white can take with the pawn. And now he's threatening this knight and also this bishop. So if the knight moves, he can just take the bishop. So after rook f8, Gukesh went rook a2. So it's still the same idea. If he takes, we take back, and hitting both the knight and bishop. So after rook a2, black went king g7, just a waiting move and also improving his king's position. Gukesh went rook a7. Magnus played this very nice move, rook d4. He says, I'm just guarding this bishop, and now I'm threatening to take the knight. So we have to move the knight, or else you just lose a piece. Here, Gukesh finds the most critical variation, that is knight f3. If he had gone for something like knight f1, here black can just take the knight and take the e4 pawn, hitting this, threatening knight c5 and take the b3 pawn also, and this is just dead lost. But Gukesh manages to keep the game going. He plays knight f3, even though it's still dead lost, but this is a very critical variation that Magnus has to find. Magnus of course goes for it. He takes the knight. Gukesh takes back. Now white is threatening the rook and the knight simultaneously. So black takes the h3 pawn, sacrificing the knight for this pawn. If here Gukesh takes this rook, he can take back. If white takes this bishop, this knight comes back with a fork and takes the rook. Okay, gh3, Gukesh takes back the knight. And now the point of this sacrifice, he takes the e4 pawn with the bishop and pinning this f3 knight. He moves, unpins the king. Magnus goes rook d1. Here actually Magnus could have directly won the game with this very nice bishop into f3, rook into f3, rook d2, king g1, e4, rook e3, and rook d3. This, I think Magnus missed this move, rook d3, because if he takes, black takes here, and then this rook is coming here, knight comes to e4 and the pawn is unstoppable. Okay, but still rook d1 is still winning. g4. Here again Magnus could have taken this knight and play d4. The same thing, rook e3 and rook d3. We'll get to see how this leaving this knight alive comes back to bite Magnus. He takes the pawn. He takes back and knight d5. Magnus, I'm sure Magnus has thought that he's a clear pawn up here. b3 is weak. He has a protected pass pawns here. He should be clearly winning this, but not so easy. Here he's hitting the rook. Rook e2. If black takes rook b3, white, I think Magnus was afraid of this. Rook knight g5, rook f1, king g2, and if he goes rook f6, he can go knight e4, and if he goes rook f4, he can go knight e6, and that's a pin. But Magnus went knight f4, rook c2, king f6. Now again, if he had taken here, I think he was afraid of rook c7 and some kind of perpetual check here. But king f6 is a very nice move. h4, king e6, just guarding this two pawn, and it's getting ready to push this b pawn. Gukesh goes knight g5, king d5, the king trying to come in. Rook a5, king d4, rook a4, king d3, and rook f2. Here is another critical point where Magnus, I think, should have gone for d5, covering this e4 square. so that the knight doesn't come back. And now he can do all sorts of rook b3 and rook d2 exchanges off, which is clearly winning. If white plays rook f3 here, he can go king c2, rook a2, king b1, rook f2, and black just takes this b3 pawn. The main difference is now white can't come back with the knight to e4 and d2 or checks like this. But Magnus here plays the mistake f6. Gukesh finds the only way to stay in the game, that is rook f3. For example, if he had gone for something like knight e4, black can simply go king e3, and now this knight is protecting this rook, and this king is attacking the d5 knight and this rook. So it's kind of entangled, and black is just threatening d5 to win the piece. Gukesh finds rook f3, king e2. So if black had gone king c2, the problem is rook a2, king b1, rook b2. If black takes this, it's a draw. And if black takes the b3 pawn, stopping the check, white knight can jumps back to e4. And now there is all sorts of threats like knight d2, knight c3. But this is still winning. But I think Magnus was afraid of this. He goes king e2, rook a2, rook d2, takes, knight e4. Mind you, all this rook f3, rook a2, rook d2, everything is only move for Gukesh, and he finds everything in the seconds. It's just unbelievable. Rook a2, rook d2, takes, knight e4. Magnus comes back, king e2, king g3. Everything is forced. Even king g3 is forced. Like, there's not a single other way that white can play. For example, if he goes rook c3, d5, takes, d4, and this pawn queens. And rook g3 is just a stupid move. He'll again go for d5, d4, and d3. The king g3, d5, knight f6, rook f8. Rook f8 is a very, very tricky move here, because if white goes knight d7, black can just go knight h5 check, gh5, rook f3, which is very important at check. If the king moves, he can take the h5 pawn with a check. But again, Gukesh finds the only way to stay in the game by going rook f2, check, king e1, and knight d7. If Magnus had gone king e3, there is this very nice knight d5 check, utilizing the spin. If Magnus takes the rook, now Gukesh takes the exchange. So Magnus goes king e1, knight d7, and now suddenly the whole game Magnus was pressing on Gukesh. He was clearly winning, and now suddenly at the time trouble he has 47 seconds. Gukesh has 20 seconds, but the move is not easy. Like, what do you play? The knight is threatening the rook. He's threatening the pawn. For example, if black goes rook e8, white can take this. If he takes the knight, white will take this, and white might even be winning. But of course, black had this nice move, knight e2, rook into e2, king into e2, king f4. And I think Magnus should have gone for this. d4, knight c4, d3, h5, gh5, gh5. All these are kind of forced. d2, takes, h6. And black just gives up the rook for this h pawn, and it's a draw. But I think Magnus was not in the mindset to draw the game, because he was clearly winning throughout, and he made the biggest blunder I've seen Magnus do in a classical game. He plays knight e2 with only 12 seconds on the clock. Mind you, this is only 10 seconds increment per move, so mistakes are pretty easy. Knight e2 is a big blunder, because what I think Magnus missed is rook into e2, king into e2, knight f8. Magnus had thought this d pawn is running because this knight is not in time to get back. But after d4, I think Magnus already saw the winning line for white. Gukesh had two winning moves. He can go either knight d7 or d6. He chose the second one, knight e6, d3, knight c5. A very, very important move, hitting this pawn. If the pawn moves, knight again comes to e4, hitting this. If he queens, knight gives a check, which is a very, very big fork. King moves, takes, and king f3. And white just goes king e4 and takes the pawn. So after knight c5, black plays king e3, stopping this knight e4 idea. And here again Gukesh finds the only move to win, that with only 30 seconds on the clock, he finds knight a4. Because black was actually threatening d2 and queen, so he had to find some crazy way to keep the knight and stop the queen. If he had taken on d3, black takes back, king f2, you might think white has two pass pawn and he should be winning. If e4, white can just come back, e3, and this pawn runs. But the problem is black won't be playing e4, he will be playing d2, king d2. If white goes h5, gh5, gh5, e4, h6, e3, king g2, e2, h7, e1 queen, h8 queen, and it's a draw, queen e4. And if white goes king f3, trying to go king e4, he can again go back to d3, king f2, again king d3, so it's again a draw. It's like the king moves like a pendulum. Okay, knight a4, e4. The problem with d2 is white can simply just play knight b2, king e2, h5, gh5, gh5, e4, h6, e3, h7, d1 queen, knight d1, king d1, h8, e2, and white is just clearly winning. So after e4, Gukesh just says, okay, you are not threatening the queen, I'll just push my own pawns. h5, gh5, gh5, king d2. King d2 is a nice move actually, threatening to go king c2 and push the pawns. If white had gone h6, king c2, h7, d2, h8 queen, d1 queen. The problem with black's play is that white is still winning. He can play queen c3, king b1, and queen b2 checkmate. But of course, Gukesh doesn't need to do all this, because after h6, black can also play e3, h7, e2, h8 queen, and e1 check. So Gukesh just plays knight b2, saying if you move the king here, I'll go knight c4, d2, I'll go h6, d1 queen, I'll go here, takes, 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 and king f4, taking this pawn. And so the only other choice is to go king c3. King c3 is again same. We can go knight d1 check, king here, knight e3, king d2, and just white just keeps the knight protected and is just clearly winning. If he had gone king, for example, to d2, I think even something like h6, king d1, h7, d2, and h8 queen is winning for white. Because if black goes e2, queen a1 check, king d2, and king f2, white just covers the e1 square. And so black went e3 after trying to go for all these moves. But e3 is just the easiest win for white. White just plays knight c4. If the king moves here, he just takes this pawn guarding this d1 square. And Magnus went king e2, white just went king f4, attacking the e3 pawn. If d2, he'll just take the e3 pawn and covers the d1 square with a knight. If he goes d1, he just takes and wins with these two pawns. So this was an unbelievable defensive effort from Gukesh, from a clearly lost position out of the opening against the world number one. He fought back till the end, and even though the rapid is not his strongest part of the game, he managed to outwit the world number one in time trouble from a clearly lost position. So I think this is one of the best games Gukesh has played, even though the first part was not that great. Thank you everyone for watching. If you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe.